Welcome back, and today I'm going to talk about recommendations for coming of age narratives. These are going to cross over different genres, so we're going to be talking horror, thrillers, even fantasy. And these are essentially stories that involve a narrative where a character comes of age, they lose their innocence, and a lot of these stories are going to hit on a lot of the classic tropes, as you're going to hear in my synopses here. I have done videos like this before, so if I don't mention one of your favorites, it's probably because I've already talked about it in a previous one, so definitely go check out my backlist videos, which I should have linked in the cards in the description if I'm doing a good job editing here. And I believe I've got 10 to talk about, so let's get started. First, let's talk about A Fine Dark Line by Joe Lansdale. And this is the book that is set in the 1950s, where we follow a boy who I believe is 13, and he is incredibly innocent, so much to the point where I believe at the beginning of the story there is a reference to something that is used in intercourse, and he doesn't even know what it is. He thinks it's a balloon, if you know what I'm talking about. And so I found him to be a very, very naive character, but soon enough he comes across the remains of two young women, and he ends up teaming up with an older gentleman, and together they go to investigate what is going on. I struggled a little bit with this one just because I found the character to be too innocent, and you can argue that the point of coming of age stories again is that loss of innocence, but I do think to make the character 13 and be that unaware of what is going on made it a little bit hard to swallow, but I do know it was a different time. Again, this is set in the 1950s, and so I definitely like this one in terms of hitting the tropes, but not my personal favorite on this list. But in terms of narrative stories that hit all the, again, beats of a coming of age story, I do think you'll want to check this one out. It was one of my first Joe Lansdale books, and definitely I want to check out more. Next, let's talk Blackmouth by Ronald Malfi, and this is a story that follows a young man who is returning back to his childhood town. He is meeting up with his childhood friends as well as his estranged brother. Something happened years ago when they were children, and now they're coming back together to reminisce about all of that and have to revisit what happened. So given the premise, you can see that the marketers really heavily recommended this book for those of you that love it. And of course, I see those recommendations or why they made that comparison, but I actually found this book reminded me more of Something Wicked This Way Comes, just in terms of style. It's a slower paced book. It's very heavily focused on, again, the nostalgic elements, the returning back home, what that means, and especially is reminiscent or focused on the relationship between the two brothers. So if you love something like that, if that sounds right up your alley, something very character driven, a little bit slower, this might be one you want to check out. I've loved this author's work many times before and recommend Ronald Malfi all the time. I tend to prefer something more in the vein of December Park, but I've already recommended that one, so this is a great chance to talk about his other coming of age story. Next is Signal to Noise by Silvia Moreno Garcia, and this is a coming of age story that's set over two different timelines, one being the 1980s in Mexico, where there is this young teenage girl growing up with her best friends, and they are dealing with all the usual things, and again, it's set in the backdrop of the 1980s, and so within the story there is a heavy focus on music, and the characters learn how to use music and their cassette players to perform a kind of magic. And then the story is also set in the then present day in, I think, the early 2000s, where this young woman is returning back to Mexico for her father's funeral, and this is causing her to revisit the past events and kind of question what actually happened all those years ago. This is one I love. It is so smart and unique. It is definitely magical realism, and done so in the way where you as a reader have to kind of decide how much is actually true. Is there actually something magical going on, or are we meant to kind of read into the story? And so I love this setup. I love the 1980s as a backdrop. I think the nostalgia is done perfectly without being over the top, and just the use of music, specifically again the 1980s music, woven into the story as a piece of magic, and the bond between friends and how that comes together and falls apart and comes together again is so well done. This was personally my introduction to Silvia Moreno Garcia, and it's a book that I've loved even more as I've revisited it over the years. I think it is so smart, and again, it's a little bit different. This one is more fantasy than some of the other books that are going to be more horror on this list. So if you're looking for something that is a female coming of age story, this is one I absolutely recommend. And let's also talk about Summer of Night by Dan Simmons, and this is a coming of age story that is set in the 1960s. The story starts at the beginning of summer, where a group of boys are just finishing up the school year and excited to move on. However, something strange is going on within the town, and they slowly begin to investigate and figure out what is happening. There are other disappearances and strange things and holes and all of that, and the story goes from there. This is one that I absolutely recommend for those of you that love It by Stephen King and are looking for something a little bit different. I do think that this one is very character focused. It has a really strong start. It is a longer coming of age story. A lot of the ones I'm recommending on this list tend to be shorter in nature, which tends to be my preference. But if you love something again in the vein of it that's going to really take its time with the characters and grow and really develop them over the long course of a story, this is one that you may really want to check out if you somehow haven't read it already. Let's talk about The Last Child by John Hart. This is a story that follows a 13-year-old boy who is looking for his lost twin sister. She disappeared years ago, and for the most part his family's kind of given up and moved on, but he never has. So what he does is after school or when he is free or in the summer, he goes around trying to look for her, trying to look for clues. And the story is so incredibly compelling. This one definitely has that mystery aspect to it because we as the reader are also trying to figure out what happened to her. And so we were introduced to different adults who give him little bits of information, and I found myself completely engrossed in the story. This is one of those cases where I picked up a book on a random whim from the library, no idea what it was about, and I could not stop reading it. At one point or another, I'm pretty sure I suspected every single character in the story, and I remember the twists and turns, and the story kept evolving. I was highly invested in it. I cared deeply for this young man, and I really felt his emotions, the loss he was feeling, and again, was completely invested in finding his sister, finding out was she still alive, and the story was incredible. I can't stop thinking about it. It's so well done and I highly recommend it. In my mind, this one is really underrated and I don't know why. Next, let's talk about Touch the Night by Max Booth III. And this is a story that follows two 12-year-old boys who pull a prank. Something goes wrong. The police come to pick them up. However, the police are perhaps not the police and there's something more going on and these boys disappear. We then follow the story from the perspective of the mothers of these missing boys who of course are trying to figure out what is going on. This is a story that is often compared to Stranger Things, and I definitely see those, especially with season 1. And so I love the aspects of the story. It's definitely tropey. Again, it hits the kind of usual beats of what you would expect to see in a story like this. You have two boys who are fooling around and being goofy and immature and pulling dumb pranks. I do love how the story brings in some conversations surrounding racism, as one of the boys is black, and so we have the conversations around the police brutality, and it actually gets pretty deep even for having what appears to be a rather surface level plot. And again, you have kind of the mystery, what is going on. There's definitely, as you can kind of tell from that synopsis, a bit of a supernatural twist, but it still kind of hits on those beats of a supernatural coming of age story while feeling fun and entertaining with just a little bit of mystery. Then let's talk about The Virgin Suicides by Jeffrey Eugenides. And this is a literary coming of age story that follows a group of sisters, and one by one they begin to commit suicide. The story is told in a really unique narrative where it's told not from the perspective of one boy, but actually a chorus of boys. And so you have this group of boys who remembers being fascinated by these beautiful young women who again were choosing to end their lives, and them from the outside as young individuals, again they weren't adults at the time, were seeing this all come to pass and trying to figure out what was going on inside that house. And so they're investigating, they're looking around, and again it's told in a coming of age narrative where you have them now as adults kind of looking back on what happened back then. It is very slow paced compared to the other books on this list. Again, this is more literary rather than horror or thriller. If you're looking for a fast-paced, action-packed ride, you're going to be disappointed because that's not what this book is trying to be. But what it is a fascinating character study that really explores certain aspects of intense conservative Christian culture, and then you have the expectation on these young girls and them fighting against those expectations, and just, it's smart, it's different, it's quiet, it's powerful. Highly recommend it. It's a little bit out of my wheelhouse, but it was really worth dabbling into something a bit different. And I think a lot of you, if you share some of my tastes and like going a bit outside the lines of horror and thrillers, will hopefully love this one too. Then let's talk about Wasps and the Ice Cream by Tim McGregor. And this is a coming of age story that is set in the 1980s. We follow a young boy who just wants to get out of the house, away from his stepmother, and just enjoy the summer, when he comes across this new girl in town and he befriends her. He really kind of almost falls in love with her or has an attraction to her. He finds out that she is involved in some kind of folk horror, or she's into witchy-like things, and she pulls him into that, and they begin to try to communicate with her dead sister who died under mysterious circumstances. So a lot of the mystery is based around what happened to this dead sister, and the story goes from there. This is one that I actually compared to The Virgin Suicides, although this one is more of a thriller narrative, because once again you have a boy from the outside seeing this mysterious girl come into town and trying to get to know her. It's again very character focused, so while there is that mystery of the sister going on, really my attention focus was on that relationship. It's very much that boy meets girl romance, but as someone who doesn't read books for the romance, I think it was well done, and it kind of fits into the story because I think a lot of readers will remember that first infatuation or love that they had as a young teenager, and so I think the author did a great job of pulling on those nostalgic strings while still making a story that's compelling, a little bit different, and a little bit mysterious. Moving on to Ghoul by Keene. This is a story that follows a group of boys in the 1980s. They are just goofing around, trying to burn time in the summer, get away from their parents, and they wander into a graveyard and they see something that just doesn't make sense. They possibly see something supernatural. They try to tell the adults in their lives, but of course the adults don't really believe them, and so they, as a group of children, have to take it on themselves to save the day. This is one that definitely will appeal to those of you that love coming-of-age stories that are surrounding a group of boys rather than individual boy or girl, and instead is very much around that camaraderie, which I do appreciate. It definitely leans into the story or narrative that we love in something like It. This book also has some really perhaps heavy-handed nostalgic elements for the 80s. I found them to be a little bit too much, where the author is constantly making references to comic books and different forms of media that I think will appeal to readers who perhaps did grow up in that era and will go, oh yeah, I forgot about that. But I do feel it's a little bit cheaper when authors do that, when they really lean into reminiscing about, oh, did you remember about this or that, rather than creating an atmosphere of nostalgia, which is what I prefer, because I love a book that can make me nostalgic for an era that I didn't necessarily grow up in. While this book kind of just hits it in the head with some really targeted media references, if that makes sense. But still a good book. If you're looking for that kind of story, you might want to check this one out still. Then for something different, let's talk about Chlorine by Jade Song. And this is a female coming-of-age narrative that follows a competitive swimmer. She is pushed into swimming by her family and then has gotten really involved or invested in it, following along with the swim club that involves her best friends. The story is one that involves intense friendships and also intense romantic feelings, where there is some queer angles as some sapphic romance potentially ensues. But what makes a story slightly leaning into the side of magical realism or perhaps horror is that as a young woman, as a swimmer, she almost feels like she herself is a mermaid or desires to become one. And that's where the story gets a little bit weird, a little bit creepy, and a little bit dark. And I kind of want to leave it there because it was so much more fun for me to experience how that comes to be itself. But it's a story that takes a while to get going. It's very character focused, again, very relationship focused, but the writing is gorgeous. It's literary and beautiful. And it's a dark mermaid story, which is one of my personal favorites. I'm always looking for more. It's something I'd love to see more of in books and movies. And I just love this one. Again, it's really original, really different. And in general, it's harder to find female coming-of-age stories. So this is one I highly recommend if you share my taste in literary horror. Next is The Stars That Wonder Darkling by Colin Malloy. And this is a coming-of-age narrative that I've seen classified as middle grade, but I think that that is a mistake. Instead, in my opinion, coming-of-age stories are meant to be read by adults. And the whole purpose of them is to, again, reflect back on that critical point in life. So I don't actually think that someone who is a middle grade reader will get a lot out of this story, because it's definitely written from the perspective of someone who is older, and the nostalgic references within the story are targeting media that are perhaps of my day and age, and definitely not of those that are, say, 10 years old right now. So within the story, we follow a young boy who is just having a good summer. However, something happens. His father's construction company accidentally opens up this cliff and possibly unleashes some sort of evil on the town. This is a case where all the kids know that something is wrong, but the adults don't realize it. And so, of course, the kids have to take it upon themselves to go and save the town. This is one that absolutely hits on a lot of the common tropes or twists and turns and plot devices of a coming-of-age narrative. So it's not reinventing it by any degree, but I found it to be very well done. It gripped me in, it held my attention, I cared deeply for the characters, and just had a really enjoyable time reading it. This book, I believe, is written by a well-known musician. I think he is the lead singer of the Decemberists. And I gotta say that often those kind of books get a bad rap because you kind of think, oh, you know, if someone's talented in one area, they're just making money off it by trying to do a book. But if I had not known that, I never would have realized it. I thought the book was top-notch quality. I thought the writing was fantastic, simple, but it fit the story very well. And I had a really good time reading this one, so this is a personal recommendation for me. Finally, let's talk about The Saturday Night Ghost Club by Craig Davidson. And if you don't recognize that author's name, this is the same author who writes as Nick Cutter, the famous and popular horror author. Now, this is the author name that he uses when he writes literary fiction, and I think it's actually his real name. I believe Nick Cutter is the pen name there, but I might be wrong. But anyway, this is one that I picked up because, again, I love Nick Cutter's work so much. And this one absolutely does fall on the literary side, so be aware of that, but it still falls into the realm of stories that you will love if you love coming-of-age narratives that are adjacent to horror. So within the story, it's set in the 1980s, and we follow a young boy who is going out with his uncle every Saturday night to go and investigate the supernatural. And again, this is less horror, so you don't necessarily expect there to be a monster jumping out of the closet. Instead, we follow him and his uncle and the other people who go and investigate with them. And it's really a story, again, of coming of age, their relationship, how this affected his life and how it framed his life and all of that. So it's very beautiful. The author is a fantastic writer, and I think really gets to show it off under this name rather than under Nick Cutter, which is more of a kind of fun narrative style that I don't think he really gets to show off his chops the same way. But if you enjoy Nick Cutter's work or just simply love a literary coming-of-age story, I highly recommend this one. And bonus points, this author is Canadian, so I'm always happy to recommend a fellow Canuck. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know of the books I talked about, are there any that you're planning on checking out for yourself? And please let me know, what is your favorite coming-of-age story, especially if it's something a little bit more underhyped, because I do feel like I've read some of the really obvious ones and I'm looking to kind of do a deep dive. If I'm ever going to do another list like this, I definitely will need to kind of dig around to find some more underrated books that hopefully some of you haven't heard of yet. If you're new to my channel, I do read a lot of horror, thriller, science fiction, fantasy, and these coming-of-age narratives. If you want to stick around, subscribe, I appreciate that. If you want to give me a thumbs up, that's great too. You can drop an emoji. Try to find something that represents coming of age. Get creative. And if you want to hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.